Hello, John Price here, Head of Customer Success at Altus. Today I'm going to talk to you about the Altus Project Online data migration tooling and what outcomes that it enables for you. So let's get stuck into it. So what are the key outcomes that you can get from the tooling? So the key one is it's an end-to-end migration process, and it's going to scoop up all of the pertinent information from Project Online and then migrate that across to Altus so that once the process is complete, you're ready to go and you can migrate those projects and the resources and all the other associated information once the process has been completed. The migration tooling is actually covered by the Altus subscription, so you're not going to have to buy or purchase any additional tools to make this process work. The solution itself is something that we have purpose built, and this provides a number of advantages. It means that it can be extended by our partners. So when they're running their own migrations, if they want to tailor or extend the migration tooling that we've built, they've got full control to do that. I think this next point is very, very critical to dwell on here, in that it avoids a need for a big bang. So often when data migrations are run, you have to basically define a cutover period and then move all of the information from system A to system B, usually over a weekend or at some point where people are not going to use the systems, so that you're not sort of losing any of the information. Our approach here enables you to run both systems in parallel, and I think this is useful for a number of reasons. The first being it gives people a glimpse of what their projects, resources, and other bits of information will look like in Altus before deciding when they want to cut over, so that people can do a bit of a comparison, A, to make sure all the information's there, but B, to get their head around the changes in the way in which they're going to manage that information. And then what can happen is when you're actually ready to move across to Altus, you can run the migration again, and the tools will pick up all the changes that have been made to the projects and other sources of information in Project Online and have that written into Altus so that you're good to go and you're not missing any of the key pieces of information. Another thing that's worth mentioning here is it enables organizations to keep using MS Project. The main advantage of Project Online was it took the desktop version, the desktop scheduling tool, and then put an enterprise layer over the top of it. So it gave PMOs control in terms of being able to set up reusable workflows, custom fields, bit of enterprise governance over the top of it. But obviously with Project Online being retired, that layer is going, and ultimately Altus will become the replacement for that. But we're not forcing people to move off using the desktop schedule. So when the migration is completed, all those schedules that have been created can be managed in exactly the same fashion that they will be managed inside of Project Online, obviously with some slight tweaks to the way in which information is served up in Altus. And I think that's pretty critical for those organizations who potentially had projects that used desktop project, but it wasn't quite fit for purpose. Altus provides a number of different opportunities that you have to use different scheduling tools. So for IT shops, they could consider using something like Azure DevOps or Jira. For smaller, lighter projects, perhaps Planner Standard would be a good option there, or potentially you can move towards Planner Premium. And we're always looking to extend the number of scheduling tools we've got, or potentially they can use the inbuilt scheduler that comes with Altus as well. And the final point here is that the process is highly automated. So reducing the amount of time it takes for the data migration to be completed is very, very important. So what information can you migrate from Project Online to Altus? And when we talk about Project Online, there's two sources of information that we're hitting here. The first one is actually Project Online itself. And the key thing that we're going to be grabbing from here is the schedules. So we're going to migrate all of the tasks, the milestones, any custom fields and their associated values, the resource rates that have been applied to resources in those schedules, and also the baselines that have been set. We're also going to grab the projects as well, and this will retain the link to the schedule, and we'll also bring across those custom fields as well. A similar situation for resources. We'll grab both the named and the generic resources and any custom field values that have been set. And finally, bringing across all the lookup tables. So the PMOs, when they will configure Project Online for their needs. They would create a number of different lookup tables. This would include flat lookup tables, hierarchical lookup tables such as the RBS, and often lookup tables to support multi-select lookup tables to select multiple values per project or per resource or even per task as well. And our migration approach scoops all of that up and honors that when it moves across to Altus. On the other side of the fence, we've got the SharePoint Online content. So these include the risks and issue lists. So again, picking them up and any custom fields that might have been added to extend those lists. And this solution itself can also be extended to do custom lists. So for example, if an action list or a decision list was potentially added to SharePoint Online, that list can be mapped to a register inside of Altus and all of the fields can be pulled across. And then last but not least, the ability to export all of the documentation out of Altus, including the folder structure, the document metadata, and the full version history of those documents. So what is the approach for the data migration? So we start off with the data export. So this is where we will connect to Project Online and SharePoint Online as well. We've got some scripts which will basically be run, and this will export all of the information. Once that part of the process has been completed, the next step here is to go into Altus and create all the required custom fields, so project, resource and task level, but also for the lists as well. Then once that part of the process is completed, the next step is to update the scripts to do that mapping between Project Online and SharePoint Online fields and Altus fields. It's worth noting here that if you haven't created any custom lists or any custom fields in Project Online, you can bypass this process and just run the scripts as they're written. We've actually done the mapping in the scripts already, so we've taken all of the out of the box fields. So for example, for risks, we've taken all of the fields that come out of the box in SharePoint Online and already mapped those across to the risk fields in Altus, saving you the need to do that yourself. If you do need to extend it, it's quite simple to extend, and we've provided plenty of script blocks and guidance for how you can do that. Then it's a case of running those scripts to actually do that process to import all the information into Altus, and then the process has been completed. Now, in our experience, it's taking anywhere between about 15 and 20 seconds for the information to be exported from Project Online, and then on the import side of the fence, somewhere between 30 and 40 seconds to do the import, and that's dependent on how much data you're importing in, most notably in the schedule. So a schedule of a couple of hundred lines is going to be a lot quicker than a schedule that has got several thousand lines. So what does this look like once the process has been completed? In this next section of the presentation, I'm going to show what the source information looks like in either Project Online or SharePoint Online, and then what it looks like once the process has been completed in Altus. So what we're looking at here is the project center in Project Online, seeing a couple of those projects listed out here with all of their information. And then once the process has been completed to migrate it in, it ends up in the initiative section in Altus. And you can see here, similar look and feel, one line per project. A couple of things to note here. There's a little icon in there called the schedule, and this puts a little icon for that external execution tool type that you picked. When the migration is completed, all of them will denote MS Project, and then obviously it's up to the organization to decide if they want to move those to use the Altus inbuilt scheduler, or potentially they might want to use some of the types I talked about earlier on, such as Azure DevOps or potentially Jira as well. Then when we're looking at resources, similar experience here. So on the left, we're looking at the resource center as it exists in Project Online, seeing all the resources that have been added into the resource center, named and generic. And then once the process has been completed, those resources are migrated into the bookable resources section within Altus. And again, seeing both the named and generic in here, and obviously where they are linked to named resources, highlighting which user within the M365 environment that named user relates to. And then we can drill down further into those resources and have a look at them. So the form on the left was the form for enterprise resources in Project Online, and then showing how it looks a little bit different inside of Altus. Now, one thing that's worth noting about the resource form in Project Online was it grouped all of those custom fields into one section and it put them in alphabetical order. And you actually didn't get any option to sort of tailor that and have it, order things in the most appropriate way for the organization. That's not the case in Altus. And what you can see here, there's a number of different controls you've got. You can add these little sections onto the form where you can sort of group similar or related pieces of information together. And then across the top, you can see there's a number of different tabs. So we've got the general tab with some general information about the resource, calendar exceptions. So for example, if someone's away on leave, the rates information. So that's where we're pulling in the cost rate information from the schedule, and then any allocations that person has booked. So it's a very much an improved user experience, and it's worth noting that also applies to projects as well. So the projects have got a number of tabs and a number of different sections within them to make it a really nice and easy experience to update that information. We then have the schedules. So on the left, we're looking at the web version of the Project Online schedule here. So seeing that breakdown of the tasks, the start, the finish dates, and all the work information. And then once that's been migrated across to Altus, when you go into the project and select the task tab, seeing a version of that information here. Now, you'll have noticed that the add task button is grayed out here. That's because this is a MS Project schedule. So the idea being that all of the updates to this particular project will be made via that MS Project connector that I was talking about earlier on. Once I do that publish, sort of similar to how MS Project and Project Online work, once the publish is completed, all that information ends up being visible in the Altus tasks view, and then obviously can be included in any reports that are required, and also applies to any task custom fields that you have set up as well. On the SharePoint Online side of the world, this is where we're picking up the lists and the documents. So on the left here, we've got a view of the risk list for a particular project and seeing each of those risks listed out here. And then on the right hand side, it's seeing the risk register in Altus. The immediate thing that stands out is the risk matrix on the left hand side. This is a very nice way of quickly and easily seeing what the risk profile is for this particular project. And with the filtering that you've got here, you can actually click on those particular cells within the risk matrix and it will actually filter the list of risks on the right hand side. So an immediate sort of improvement there. And you can actually see here, to improve the navigation, you can actually see there are a number of other different registers over the top as well. So you've got decisions and actions and issues. And again, this can be extended to include as many risks as you want, and you can actually tailor the risks that you see by the different project types that you might have set up. A similar look and feel for issues as well. So on the left hand side, seeing that issue list inside of SharePoint Online, and then when we go over here onto the right hand side, seeing that as it looks inside of Altus. It's worth noting here that one of the Achilles heels of the SharePoint Online lists was that people could go in and sort of start messing about with the configuration that had been pushed out by the enterprise PMO. That is definitely not a weakness inside of Altus. So those fields that appear in that form there, as the end user, I've got no ability to rename or change any of those, which makes it nice and easy for the PMO to sort of retain that sort of standardization of those fields across the portfolio. And then last but not least, we have documents. So project documents being a very important part of a project inside of Project Online, stored inside of SharePoint Online document libraries. And then with this one here, there's actually a couple of options that you've got here. Altus out of the box has groups and teams integration. So what you can do is when you create a project, you create a group that creates a group for the project, but also creates a team as well, and it surfaces the project in that team's channel. That's great for active projects. A lot of customers might not want to create a whole bunch of teams for projects that are closed, and we've taken that into account as well. So the document library that you're seeing on the right hand side here is a standalone SharePoint site with a SharePoint document library in. which has no group and no teams attached to it. And in this case, those documents are just being moved across that document library, and Altus is serving it up in a consistent manner to the way in which it would serve up documents if they were attached to a group or to a team. So that's the end of the walkthrough of the data migration. If you want to know any more information about the data migration, please reach out to us. We are publishing a lot of information on our publicly facing website. And if you're an Altus partner, please ensure that you attend our sessions where we're going to talk more about this process in more detail, and also about the enhancements that we're making to Altus to make it the best possible PPM tool.